If words can destroy a reputation in seconds, why do we throw them around so carelessly, especially when talking about those who cannot defend themselves? The February sun barely broke through the heavy clouds hanging over the campus of Riverdale College. The old red brick buildings covered in a thin layer of snow gave the place a stately, almost aristocratic air that was so prized in the advertising brochures. This prestigious private college, located in a picturesque corner of Maine, was proud not only of its 300-year history, but also of its reputation as an intellectual haven where the most daring debates were encouraged. Barron Trump, a tall, dark-haired young man with an upright posture and an alert gaze, strode down the snow-shoveled path toward the liberal arts building. He wore casual jeans, a gray hoodie under a heavy jacket, and a battered backpack, a deliberately nondescript look. No expensive watch or designer clothing to give away his background. His college records listed him as Barry Thompson, and for 3 weeks of the spring semester, no one suspected that they were studying alongside the son of the sitting president of the United States, who a month ago had returned to the Oval Office, setting off a new wave of political upheaval in the country he had reasons to hide. After 8 years at the center of a relentless media cyclone and a brief respite, and now finding himself again as the son of a sitting president after endless headlines, cartoons, and in-comments about his family, Barron craved anonymity. The chance to be just a student, not the son of the same Trump who was back in the White House. He checked his phone. It was Professor Judith Mallow's lecture was almost half an hour away, but Barron liked to arrive early and sit in the third row, close enough to see everything but not so close that he would be conspicuous. He turned toward the cafeteria, deciding to grab a coffee before class. The smell of freshly ground beans mingled with the aroma of baked goods and the low hum of voices. Students gathered around tables, leafing through notes, laughing, or sleepily staring at their phones. The Baron walked to the counter and ordered an Americano. "Double espresso with almond milk, please," a female voice said nearby. The Baron recognized Elizabeth Chen, editor of the Riverdale Chronicle, a student newspaper, and one of the most vocal participants in Mallow's class debates. A petite Asian woman with a short haircut and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses, she was known for her sharp political commentary and feminist views. "To Mallow's lecture?" she asked, noticing the media analysis textbook peeking out of his backpack. "Yes," the Baron answered shortly, trying not to continue the conversation. "This is going to be interesting." Elizabeth lowered her voice, leaning closer. "They say she's going to tear this administration apart. She's been furious since the inauguration in January. My roommate is her assistant, and she saw the presentation. There's a whole section on women who betrayed feminism and the democratic backsliding of 2025. The Baron felt the muscles in his back tense, but he kept his expression neutral. "It sounds politicized for an academic environment," he noted carefully. Elizabeth snorted. "And you, apparently, are one of those who believe in objectivity? Mallow is right. Neutrality in the face of injustice means taking the side of the oppressor." She took her coffee. "See you in the classroom." And without waiting for an answer, she headed for the exit. The Baron took a deep breath as he took his drink. He was used to this kind of conversation. At Riverdale, as at many elite schools, progressive views were practically a mandatory dress code. Any deviation, or even an attempt to present an alternative point of view, was often met with bewilderment or outright hostility. As he left the cafeteria, he overheard a snippet of conversation from a group of students passing by. "And then she compared Melania Trump to Marie Antoinette," the guy in the plaid shirt exclaimed. "Like, while the country is sliding back into the Middle Ages, she's doing another pompous renovation of the White House. Have you seen those new curtains in the East Wing? They cost as much as a year's scholarship." A burst of laughter rippled through the group. "Mallow is going to destroy her tonight," chimed in the pink-haired girl, "especially after that traditional values speech she gave last week. I'm already getting my tweets ready. Trump Sauer destroying America will be trending by lunchtime." The Baron tightened his grip on his coffee cup. The feeling of foreboding was growing, but he could not deviate from his intended path. If he started skipping classes because of political disagreements, he would never complete his education. Besides, wasn't that why he had come here, to hear other points of view? To understand why people hated his family so fiercely? The Humanities Building was a stately neo-Gothic building with pointed turrets and stained glass windows. The interior smelled of old books, wood polish, and the faint scent of lavender used to freshen the air in the classrooms. The Baron climbed the wide staircase to the second floor and headed for room 237, where he was taking a course called Media Analysis and Critical Theory. "Hey, Thompson," Jason, a philosophy student with whom he sometimes ate lunch, called out. "Are you ready for the clash of the titans?" "What are you talking about?" The Baron stopped at the door of the auditorium. I heard Professor Hartman from the Conservative Studies Department is going to be in class today. Jason lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Professor Mallow strongly dislikes him. I'm hoping for an epic showdown. Well, Hartman doesn't have a chance, the Baron responded with involuntary bitterness. He'll be torn to pieces here. Come on, academic debate is almost a sport. The best one wins, Jason shrugged. Or the one with the most fans in the stands, Baron countered. Jason looked at him strangely. Dude, are you okay? You look tense. I just didn't get enough sleep, the Baron lied as he walked into the classroom. The room was already filling with students. Most of them were in the seats in the center and at the front, the best places to be noticed by Mallow, who was known for rewarding active participants in discussions with extra points. The Baron had chosen his usual place in the third row at the side, where he could observe the proceedings while remaining relatively unnoticed. He pulled out his laptop and opened a blank document to take notes. Ryan, a track athlete with perpetually tousled red hair, plopped down in the seat next to him. Hello, new guy, he called to the Baron. Have you heard about today's topic? Something about the former administration, the Baron answered evasively. Yeah, and it's going to be fire. Ryan rubbed his hands together excitedly. My girlfriend in political science says Mallow rewrote the entire course after the inauguration in January. She collected the juiciest quotes from press conferences and scandalous photos from state receptions. She's furious about the election results and she's not going to hide it. I can't wait to see her tear apart those hypocritical conservatives who are back in power. The Baron felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. Shouldn't universities teach critical thinking instead of telling students what to think? He asked quietly. Ryan laughed. Listen, critical thinking is realizing that the right is a hypocrite and a bigot. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. A fact requires proof, Barron noted. Oh, trust me, Mallow has plenty of them. Just listen and learn. At that moment, Professor Judith Mallow walked into the room. She was tall, slender, in her 50s, with perfectly coiffed graying hair and a piercing gaze. She was dressed in an elegant tweed suit and carried a stack of materials. The buzz of conversation died down at her entrance. Mallow had that special quality that made people immediately take notice of her. A mixture of authority, intelligence, and a touch of arrogance. The Baron watched as she methodically arranged the materials on the lectern, turned on the projector, checked the microphone settings. All her movements were precise, economical, without unnecessary fuss. The title of the presentation appeared on the large screen, Symbolic Violence in Female Solidarity, Regression in 2025. Elizabeth Chen took a seat in the front row, ostentatiously taking out a tape recorder and notepad. Several student journalists followed suit. The Baron noted that the auditorium was almost full. Even the usually empty back rows were filled with students. Looks like it's a sellout tonight, Ryan whispered. Everyone wants to see a verbal execution. The phrase echoed in the Baron's ears like a terrifying echo. Verbal execution. Public execution. A crowd hungry for bread and circuses. History was repeating itself, only instead of the Colosseum, a university auditorium, instead of gladiators, political opponents, instead of swords, words that could hurt no less deeply. The screen flashed an image of the White House with the presidential standard, then photos of the January 2025 inauguration and recent press conferences in the Rose Garden. The Baron spotted his father at the presidential table, his mother at state receptions, several current advisors, faces he knew not as political symbols, but as real people, with their own weaknesses, fears, hopes, people who laughed, cried, doubted, people who tried to do what they thought was right, even when others disagreed with them. And now they will be dissected, ridiculed, demonized. And none of them will be able to defend themselves here, in this audience. They will not be allowed to speak. Except, the Baron suddenly realized that he was the only one who could present the other side, the only one who knew the truth behind the headlines and the memes. Should he remain silent, maintaining his anonymity and comfort? Or should he speak out, risking everything he had built here over the past weeks? His thoughts were racing through his head as Professor Mallow stepped up to the podium and scanned the room with her trademark piercing gaze. Good morning, colleagues, she began in her characteristically clear voice. Unlike many professors, she never called students only colleagues, emphasizing an academic equality that, however, rarely extended to ideological equality. Today, we continue our study of media images and their impact on public consciousness. Last week, we talked about double standards in the coverage of female politicians. Today, I want to address a more complex and certainly more relevant topic, the historical regression that we are witnessing in 2025 after the recent elections. She paused, changing the slide. A photo of Melania Trump appeared on the screen, impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed and made up, with that characteristic neutral expression that the media loved to interpret as coldness or aloofness. Melania Trump, the professor said, with undisguised irony in her voice. Again, the First Lady, a former model, an immigrant from Slovenia. It would seem that the American dream is in the flesh from a small town in Eastern Europe to the top of the American social ladder, twice to the White House. But what does the return of this image in 2025 tell us about the regression of the female role in modern American society? What example does she set for young women in America today when women's rights are again under threat? And most importantly, what does the new chapter in the story of the silent beauty say about the collective choice of the nation in favor of traditionalism and against emancipation? A murmur of anticipation ran through the audience. The students sat up straight, ready for the performance. The Baron felt his heart begin to beat faster. He knew what was coming next. Naked criticism, ridicule, a one-sided dissection of a woman who could not defend herself here. His mother. Professor Mallow picked up the projector remote, preparing to change the slide. Let's begin with an analysis of body language and wardrobe choices, and how they shape public perceptions of... Baron's fingers froze over the keyboard. Every cell in his body screamed, "Stop this!" But his mind warned him of the consequences. That he would lose everything he had come here for: anonymity, a normal student life, the opportunity to study without the trail of his last name. The choice was painful, but necessary. How to respond to injustice, to remain silent, or to speak up. The professor switched the slide, and a selection of mocking Melania memes and cartoons appeared on the screen, including some fresh from the January 2025 inauguration, with captions such as "She's back," "Traditional values are back in fashion," and "Silence is golden, but only for the women of the White House." The audience responded with chuckles and cheers, and at that moment the Baron made his choice. Professor Mallow pressed a button on the remote control, and a new slide appeared on the huge screen with a large headline: "Regressive Symbolism, the Return of the Archaic Model of Woman in American Politics." Under the headline was a photograph of Melania Trump at her recent inauguration, perfectly coiffed hair, flawless makeup, a restrained smile. Back to our topic, the professor moved around the podium with the energy of a seasoned preacher. In January 2025, America took another step backwards. And it's not just the policy decisions of the Newell administration, it's the symbols we choose, or that are chosen for us. She pressed the button again, and a comparison chart appeared on the screen. On the left were photos of Melania at various official events. On the right were quotes from speeches and interviews by other first ladies, from Eleanor Roosevelt to Jill Biden. Notice the contrast, Mallow pointed a laser at the screen. Most first ladies use their platform to promote social change, to make a personal statement. And what do we see now? A return to the silent, decorative spouse, a model we thought we left behind in the last century. The Baron clenched his fists under the table. He promised himself not to react, to remain objective, to perceive this as a sociological experiment. But with every word the professor said, it became more difficult. Think about it, Mallow continued, her voice ringing in the utter silence of the audience. A woman who supposedly speaks 5 languages, but whose rare public appearances are limited to short, pre-written speeches. A woman whose primary function seems to be to appear impeccable around her husband. The screen showed headlines from fashion magazines discussing Melania's outfits, alongside cartoons from social media. And that model is being passed on to millions of girls and young women as an example of success. Mallow spread her hands. Marry a rich man, look perfect, keep quiet about serious matters. In 2025, that's the ideal being offered again. This is some kind of, muttered the Baron, not realizing that he was speaking out loud. Sitting next to him, Ryan glanced at him in surprise. Professor Mallow, who had the hearing of a cat, caught the remark. Does anyone have any objections? Please share them with everyone. Every head in the audience turned in their direction. The Baron froze, feeling like a deer in headlights. No, Ryan began, clearly not wanting to be the center of attention. Actually, I have an objection. The Baron heard his voice as if from the outside. Mallow squinted, trying to see who was speaking. Please, Mr. Thompson. Barry Thompson, the Baron replied, rising slowly from his seat. His heart was pounding, but his voice was surprisingly steady. You're a second year, right? A new student? Mallow looked at him with polite curiosity. She always remembered the active participants in discussions, but often confused the quiet students. Yes, I transferred this semester, Baron nodded, and I'd like to point out a methodological problem in your analysis. A murmur of surprise went through the audience. Few dared to contradict Mallow, especially on a topic so close to her heart. A methodological problem? The professor raised an eyebrow. That sounds intriguing. Go ahead, Mr. Thompson. We're all listening. The Baron felt dozens of eyes turn towards him. He spotted Elizabeth Chen in the front row, turning in her chair, clearly intrigued by the unexpected turn of events. You present a person through a montage of filtered media images, ignoring context and alternative interpretations, he began. That's not academic analysis, that's confirmation bias. The audience froze. Such a direct objection was rare. Mallow removed her glasses, a gesture the students called preparing for an intellectual execution. Clarify your position, Mr. Thompson. Her voice grew dangerously soft. What context do you think I'm ignoring? For example, the fact that Melania Trump grew up in communist Yugoslavia, where free expression could have serious consequences, or that English is not her native language, and the media mercilessly mocked her accent for years, or that her social initiatives, including a campaign against cyberbullying and support for children with opioid addiction, were systematically ignored by most media. A ringing silence fell over the room. The students looked at each other in amazement. Someone started quickly Googling the mentioned facts on their phone. You are remarkably knowledgeable about the First Lady's background, Mr. Thompson, Mallow observed, her tone softening with wary curiosity. But that doesn't change the fact that public figures are judged by their public actions and statements, or lack thereof. But are public actions limited to those that make headlines? Barron countered. I'm talking about systematic bias in reporting. When Melania visited children's hospitals, it got minimal coverage. When she wore a certain jacket or shoes, it became national news. One of the students whistled softly. The tension in the room grew. What are you suggesting, Mr. Thompson? Mallow leaned on the lectern, studying him closely. Ignore the symbolic importance of the First Lady in the national psyche? Not analyze how her silence and submission normalize a certain pattern of female behavior? I suggest you don't confuse silence with submission. The Baron met her gaze. Not all who speak little think little. Some simply choose to speak only when they really have something to say. Poetically put, Mallow smiled, but without warmth. But we're talking about a woman whose most important public statement in recent years has been "be best," a grammatically incorrect phrase that has become a byword for superficial activism. What about her statement against the policy of separating families at the border? Barron countered. Or her criticism of hate speech on social media? Or her diplomatic work in visits to other countries, where her language skills and cultural sensitivity have been repeatedly praised by international leaders? I must admit, Mr. Thompson, you've done well to prepare. Mallow looked more intrigued than annoyed. But this all sounds like a very definite prospect, almost like a press release. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. The Baron felt his face grow red. The moment of truth was approaching. This is not a press release. He straightened his shoulders. This is an alternative viewpoint that, unfortunately, is rarely voiced in academic circles. We constantly talk about diversity of perspectives, but when it comes to certain political figures, that diversity disappears. Because some perspectives are based on facts, and some perspectives are based on alternative facts, Mallow snapped. A murmur of approval swept through the audience. Many students nodded. Who determines which facts are alternative? Barron pressed. Doesn't that depend on which news sources you prefer? Which social circles shape your worldview? Which algorithms filter your newsfeed? Mallow narrowed her eyes. What are you getting at, Mr. Thompson? The point is that each of us lives in an information bubble, Barron replied. And academic integrity requires acknowledging that and actively seeking out opposing viewpoints, especially when it comes to analyzing public figures. And what opposing viewpoint is missing from my analysis? Mallow crossed her arms over her chest. The perspective of someone who knows Melania Trump personally. Barron took a deep breath. Someone who has seen her not through the filter of the media, but in real life. There was complete silence in the audience. All eyes were on the Baron. And you, I suppose, are familiar with such a prospect? Mallow's voice was distrustful. More than... The Baron drew himself up to his full height. My real name is not Barry Thompson. I am Barron Trump. Melania Trump is my mother. The effect was immediate and deafening. A collective gasp rolled through the room, like the sound of an approaching wave. Someone in the back shouted, "Come on!" Another student dropped his phone. Elizabeth Chen froze, her mouth open, her fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard. Professor Mallow froze, her face a mask of professional neutrality. But the Baron noticed how her fingers had turned white as she gripped the edge of the lectern. That's unexpected, she finally said, trying to regain control of the situation. If that's true, then you can check, Barron offered calmly, taking his passport out of his backpack. My photo is on Wikipedia and on the White House website. Several students were already frantically checking this information on their phones. Waves of whispers rolled through the room like ripples on water. "Damn, it's really him," someone on the right said loudly. "He's the spitting image of his father, only younger." "Wow, he's been studying with us all this time?" exclaimed a blue-haired girl from the front row. Mallow took a deep breath, clearly gathering her thoughts. "Mr. Trump, I understand it must be difficult to hear a critical analysis of a member of your family, but an academic discussion—" "This isn't about critical analysis, Professor," the Baron interrupted, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "This is about one-sided denigration of a man you don't know, a man who deserves far more respect than ridicule for his accent or his wardrobe." The audience seemed to hold its breath. The Baron felt his heart pounding in his chest, from the adrenaline, from the knowledge that there was no turning back. He had just destroyed everything he had spent all these weeks building up, his anonymity, his ordinary student life. But strangely, he felt not fear, but relief and a strange clarity. At that moment, he was not the son of a president, not the heir to a famous family name. He was simply a man defending his mother from injustice. "If you allow me, Professor," his voice was surprisingly calm and confident, "I would like to tell you about the Melania Trump I know, the real person behind the media image." Professor Mallow stared at him, her expression unreadable. The seconds ticked by in tense silence. Then she nodded slowly. "I think the audience will enjoy hearing your perspective," she said finally. The Baron glanced around the room, seeing shock, curiosity, disbelief, and in some cases, outright hostility. But he also saw something else. Attention. Real, genuine attention. People willing to listen. For the first time in his life, he had the opportunity to speak not as Trump's son, but as someone who knew the truth the headlines weren't telling. And he intended to use the opportunity to finally give a voice to someone whose voice had so often been ignored. The silence in the room was deafening. The Baron could feel his heart pounding in his ears, but he maintained the calm he had learned from years of living in the spotlight. He noticed several students already reaching for their phones to capture the historic moment. Some were frantically typing messages. The news that the president's son was a student at Riverdale and had just revealed his identity was surely already spreading across campus at lightning speed. Professor Mallow was the first to break the silence, her professional instincts overcoming her shock. "Mr. Trump," she cleared her throat slightly, "I must admit, this is an unexpected turn, but let's take advantage of the situation. Academic discussion can only benefit from the inclusion of diverse perspectives." Her tone was impeccably professional, but the Baron noticed the way her voice wavered. It wasn't every day that a professor found himself publicly ridiculing the mother of one of his students. "I suggest you come up here." Mallow pointed to a spot near the podium. "The audience will be able to see and hear you better." The Baron walked slowly through the students, feeling their gazes on him. Some looked at him with open curiosity, others with distrust, others with barely concealed hostility. As he stepped up to the podium, he turned to face the audience. 100 pairs of eyes followed his every move. "Before I begin," Barron said, his voice calm and confident, "I want to be clear. I am not here to defend the administration's policy positions. I am not here as a representative of the White House. I am here as a son who wants to talk about his mother, a real person, not a caricature created for political purposes." "So you're admitting that your father uses rhetoric that—" the pink-haired student began. "I'm not here to discuss my father's policies," the Baron interrupted firmly. "If you're asking my opinion on the administration's policies, that's a different conversation. What I want to talk about now is the man everyone here has been talking about, but no one really knows." Professor Mallow nodded. "Fair enough. Proceed, Mr. Trump." The Baron took a deep breath. "My mother was born in a small, industrial town in communist Yugoslavia, a country where freedom of speech was limited, where political conformity was a necessity for survival. Her family was not rich or privileged. Her father worked as a driver, her mother in a clothing factory." He noticed how some students were clearly surprised. These details were rarely mentioned in the media. At 16, she began her modeling career. No connections, no fortune, no knowledge of languages, just natural beauty and an iron will. By 18, she was already working in Milan and Paris, studying Italian and French on her own, in parallel with her work. She entered the University of Ljubljana, Faculty of Architecture and Design. No one sponsored her, no one gave her patronage, she made her own way. "This information is very interesting," Mallow interjected, "but how relevant is it to an analysis of her role as a public figure in contemporary America?" "Very relevant," Barron countered, "because you can't analyze a person without ignoring the formative experiences of her life. Her childhood under an authoritarian regime, her self-made career, her experience as an immigrant, all of these things shape her worldview and her choices. "And what choices does she make?" asked a hijab-wearing student in the third row. "Why does she so rarely speak out publicly?" "Good question," the Baron nodded at her. "My mother speaks 5 languages, but none of them are her native language. Imagine yourself in a situation where your every word, every accent, every grammatical error becomes the object of national ridicule, where the media happily quotes your slips of the tongue, creating the image of an uneducated foreigner." Several foreign students exchanged knowing glances. "So yes, she chooses to speak publicly rarely, but that doesn't mean she's silent in private. Behind closed doors, she speaks her mind without hesitation, and believe me, in our family, her opinion is listened to." "Can you give me specific examples of her influence?" Elizabeth Chen asked, breaking the silence for the first time. There was genuine interest in her voice, not skepticism. When the separation of families at the border began in 2018, Barron looked directly at her. She was one of the first to speak out against the policy. Her official statement came on June 19. "Mrs. Trump hates to see children separated from their families and hopes that both sides can come together to achieve successful immigration reform. She believes in upholding the laws, but also being a country that leads with the heart." He paused, looking at the surprised faces. The next day, the president signed an executive order ending the practice of separating families. Few people know about this cause and effect because it didn't fit the dominant narrative. "But her famous jacket," someone from the back row began. "Yes, the famous 'I really don't care, do you' jacket," Barron nodded, "which she wore once, on her way to the plane, not while visiting her children. That jacket became the main news story, overshadowing the fact of her visit and her actual actions and words. And it perfectly illustrates the problem with media coverage form always overshadows content. But isn't it strange to wear such a jacket at such a sensitive moment?" The same voice insisted. "It was a message to the media, not to the children and not to the public," Barron said bluntly. "The message was, I don't care what you write about me." It may not have been the best timing, but after 2 years of constant criticism, where even her decision to plant trees in the Rose Garden was analyzed as a political statement, yes, it was a human response. "An interesting interpretation," Mallow said, her professional mask softening slightly. "But to return to the larger question, how do you assess the symbolic influence of your mother on the perception of women's roles in society?" "I think it's a matter of perspective," Barron said. "For some, she represents the traditional image of a wife supporting her husband. For others, she represents the self-made immigrant who achieved the American dream. For others, she represents someone who values privacy in an era of excessive publicity." He paused, looking around the audience. "But the irony is that we rarely ask how Melania herself sees her role. We project our expectations, our political hopes or fears onto her. We turn her into a symbol, forgetting that behind it there is a real person with her own history and beliefs." "And what are her beliefs?" Elizabeth asked bluntly. "Has she ever spoken out about women's rights, about gender equality, about issues that concern millions of American women?" "Her core belief is that every person has the right to dignity," Barron replied, "to privacy, to be free from bullying and abuse." Her Be Best campaign focused on the well-being of children, especially on social media, where cyberbullying has reached epidemic proportions. "But this campaign was so harmless," countered another student. While the country was facing really serious problems, an immigration crisis, growing inequality, threats to democratic institutions. "What if caring for kids who are being bullied isn't a benign issue?" Barron said, sounding annoyed for the first time. 40% of American teens report being cyberbullied. It's associated with increased risk of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. This isn't a lighthearted issue. It's a mental health crisis for the young generation. His words seemed to make many people think. Some students nodded. "Also," he continued more calmly, "part of the Be Best initiative was about the opioid crisis and the children affected by it. My mother visited hospitals, talked to families, supported recovery programs, but it rarely made headlines. Because it wasn't controversial enough," Elizabeth said quietly, as if thinking out loud. "Exactly," nodded the Baron. "In a world where scandal and conflict attract attention, constructive work often goes unnoticed." "But your mother chose a public role," Mallow interjected. "And with that role comes the responsibility to use her platform to make meaningful change." "Who determines what changes are significant?" Barron countered. "Is political loudness the only criterion? Or is quiet, consistent work with real people also valuable?" The professor thought for a moment, then nodded. "A fair question. I'm not asking you to share my family's political views," Barron said to the entire audience. I'm not even asking you to like or admire my mother. I'm asking you to see her as a person, not a symbol. A woman with her own history, her own fears, her own values. A woman who, like all of us, makes choices based on her own life experiences and beliefs. You know, a girl of Asian appearance from the fifth row suddenly spoke up. My mother is also an immigrant. She speaks perfect English. She has a PhD in biochemistry, but she is still afraid of public speaking because of her accent. People often mistake an accent for a sign of low intelligence, and it hurts. Thank you for sharing this, Barron responded sincerely. Yes, the accent is becoming stigmatized, especially for women. For men, it can be perceived as exotic or charismatic. For women, it can be seen as a sign of incompetence. I think we're getting away from the real question, a student with a beard and glasses interjected. Regardless of your mother's personal history, the fact remains that she supports an administration whose policies have done real harm to countless women, immigrants, minorities. I'll say it again, Barron replied firmly. I'm not here to debate administration policy. I'm here to remind you of the humanity behind political labels, that even people whose views you strongly disagree with deserve to be seen as complex, full individuals, not caricatures. A noble position, Mallow noted, her tone softening, though I'm not sure it applies in a world where political decisions have real consequences on people's lives. On the contrary, Barron countered, it is precisely because politics has real consequences that we need dialogue, not monologue, understanding, not demonization. When we turn opponents into caricatures, we lose the opportunity to find common ground. A buzz of discussion swept through the room. Many of the students seemed impressed not so much by the content of his words as by the calm confidence with which he delivered them. Mr. Trump, a student with long blonde hair, said to him, "You talk about your mother as a strong, independent woman. But didn't her marriage to your father undermine that independence, given all the scandals and public humiliations?" The Baron felt his jaw tighten. The question hit a sore spot. "I won't discuss my parents' personal relationship," he replied after a pause. "That's their private life. I will say only this. Too often we present women as either victims or heroines, leaving no room for the complex human reality in between." "That's an evasive answer," the student noted. "No, that's the only answer I can give that respects my family's privacy," Barron retorted. "You don't expect me to publicly analyze my parents' marriage, do you?" The girl was embarrassed and shook her head. "Mr. Trump," Elizabeth Chen interjected, "you mentioned your mother's statement against the family separation policy. Have there been other times when she has spoken out against the administration on important issues? Was she a public dissident?" "No," Barron answered honestly. "But in private discussions she always expressed her opinions, often critical ones. And this influenced decisions, even if this cause and effect relationship was not visible to the public." "But is that enough?" Elizabeth insisted. "Private dissent, when public support legitimizes controversial policies?" The Baron met her gaze. "Would you rather have her publicly confront her husband, turn the family dynamic into a reality show, or influence him in private, bringing about real change without the public spectacle?" "That's a false dichotomy," Elizabeth countered. "There are many ways to show integrity without destroying the family. For example," the Baron raised an eyebrow, "for example, using your platform to support organizations working on issues that run counter to some of the administration's policies." "You mean like her support for LGBT organizations fighting bullying? Or her work with feminist groups fighting human trafficking?" Barron asked. Elizabeth blinked. "I didn't know about that." "Not surprising," Barron nodded. "These facts don't fit the dominant narrative, so they don't get media coverage." Professor Mallow watched the exchange carefully, her face deeply thoughtful. Finally, she glanced at her watch and addressed the audience. "We have 5 minutes left in class," she announced. "And I think something has happened that I hadn't planned for when I prepared the lecture. We've encountered a living example of how media images can diverge from reality, how our biases shape our perceptions of public figures." She turned to the Baron. "Mr. Trump, I appreciate your candor and courage. Not everyone would choose to defend a loved one in such a, shall we say, potentially hostile environment." "I'm not just defending my mother," Barron replied. "I'm defending the idea that every human being deserves to be seen in all their complexity, that we lose something important when we reduce people to convenient labels, conservative, liberal, feminist, traditionalist." He glanced around the room. "I'm not asking you to change your political beliefs. I'm just asking you to remember that behind every political symbol is a real person, complex, contradictory, but always deserving of basic respect for their humanity." The bell rang, signaling the end of class. But no one moved. All eyes were directed first to the Baron, Then to Professor Mallow. "Colleagues," Mallow said to the students, "today we learned a lesson that was not in our program. A lesson about how easily we turn people into symbols and symbols into caricatures. And perhaps about how difficult it is to see the real people behind those caricatures." She paused as if collecting her thoughts. "In the next session, we will continue our discussion, but with a new perspective. I invite everyone to consider how our own information bubbles shape our perception of the world." The students began to pack their things, but many were in no hurry to leave. Some approached the podium, clearly wanting to continue the conversation with the Baron. Elizabeth Chen was first. "I'm the editor of the Riverdale Chronicle," she said, looking Barron straight in the eye. "And I'd like to interview you. A real interview with no bias. Let you tell your side of the story." The Baron studied her face, trying to figure out whether the offer was sincere or just another attempt to get a scoop. "Why should I trust you?" he asked bluntly. 10 minutes ago, you were laughing at cartoons of my mother." Elizabeth didn't look away. "Because good journalists change their minds when new facts come to light. And because I just realized that I was part of the very problem you were talking about, seeing the symbol, not the person." Their eyes met, the daughter of liberal activists and the son of a conservative president. Two young people with opposing political views, but perhaps a shared desire for truth. "I'll think about it," the Baron finally answered. Professor Mallow, who had been observing the exchange, approached them. "Mr. Trump, I would like to apologize for some of the overly emotional characterizations I used in my lecture. It was unprofessional." The Baron looked at her carefully. "Thank you, Professor. But this isn't about apologizing. This is about pursuing the truth, even when it doesn't suit our preferences. Isn't that what a university is supposed to teach?" Mallow nodded slowly. "You're right, and you taught us all a valuable lesson today." A small group of students had already gathered behind the podium, eager to speak with the Baron. Some looked friendly, others wary, but all were clearly interested. "It looks like my incognito period in Riverdale is officially over," Barron quietly remarked, looking at the line that had formed. "Perhaps," Elizabeth smiled slightly, "but at least something new is beginning. A real dialogue, without masks and prejudices." The Baron wasn't sure it was that simple. Masks and prejudices had a way of coming back. But at that moment, looking at the students who had moved from mockery to a desire to listen, he felt a glimmer of hope. Room 237, a typical venue for academic lectures, became a space for genuine dialogue for 15 minutes. And while no one could have predicted what would happen next, something important had already happened. A moment of truth had broken through layers of prejudice, reminding everyone in the room that behind every political label, there is a real, complex, living person. When the Baron finished speaking, the room fell silent. Not just an absence of noise, but a special kind of silence, filled with awareness, internal struggle, reassessment. The students who had been laughing at the professor's sarcastic comments just 15 minutes earlier now sat motionless, many with their eyes downcast. Professor Mallow stood at the lectern, her usual commanding stance replaced by something more hesitant, almost vulnerable. The Baron could hear only the beating of his own heart and the soft hum of the projector. This moment of silence lasted perhaps no more than 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. In this silence, something important was happening, an unspoken but palpable change. Then the bell rang, signaling the end of class. But unlike on normal days, no one jumped up from their seats grabbing their backpacks. No one rushed to the exit. Instead, the students began to look at each other, as if unsure of what to do next in this unprecedented situation. Professor Mallow was the first to break the silence, her professional instincts overriding her obvious inner turmoil. "Colleagues," she began, her voice not as confident as usual, "our time is up, but I see that many of you would like to continue this discussion. I will not detain those who are in a hurry to get to the next class, but the rest of you are welcome to stay." A few students stood up and headed for the exit, but most remained seated. Some even moved closer, forming a tighter circle around the podium where the Baron and Professor Mallow stood. "Mr. Trump," Mallow continued, her tone noticeably softening, "I must admit, your presentation was impressive. You made me think about some aspects of my analysis. It's rare in academia to be able to present an alternative viewpoint so effectively." The students looked at each other in surprise. Professor Mallow was famous for her intransigence in intellectual debates. This admission was almost unprecedented. "I wasn't trying to undermine you, Professor," the Baron replied calmly, stepping down from the podium. "I just wanted the other side of the story to be told." "And that's entirely right," Mallow nodded. "Academics should be able to hear different points of view, even and especially those we disagree with." Elizabeth Chen rose from her seat in the front row and came closer. "Can I ask a question?" she asked Barron. Her tone was surprisingly gentle for a student known for her hardline political positions. Of course, the Baron nodded. Why did you choose anonymity? You could have gone to any university and gotten all the perks that come with your name. Why hide? For a moment, the audience was silent again. It was a really interesting question. Because I wanted to be judged by my own actions and words, Barron answered after a short pause. Not by what the newspapers wrote about my family, not by the prejudices associated with my last name. I wanted to be just a student who could speak his mind freely without fear that every word would be analyzed through the prism of politics. And how did you manage to do it until today? Elizabeth asked. Not bad, the Baron smiled. I learned a lot. I heard points of view I would never have heard in my normal environment. It was educational. That's why you chose Riverdale, the campus known for its liberal views? Asked a student with glasses from the third row. Partly. I wanted to get out of my information bubble, to see the world through the eyes of people whose views are radically different from my own. And what did you see? Elizabeth asked quietly, but everyone heard. The Baron met her gaze. I saw that we had much more in common than met the eye, that behind the labels liberal and conservative were real people with hopes, fears, beliefs, people who, in general, wanted the same thing, a fair, prosperous society, but disagreed on how to achieve it. Nice word, the tattooed student said skeptically. But when it comes to real politics, all these differences in understanding lead to real consequences for real people. I agree, the Baron replied unexpectedly. That's why we need dialogue, not monologue, to find solutions that take into account different perspectives and needs. Professor Mallow watched the exchange with interest. Well, it seems we have witnessed a living illustration of something I often talk about in my classes, how the personal becomes political. Mr. Trump, you have taken a courageous step today in revealing your identity. What do you think the consequences will be? The Baron thought for a moment. I can't be just a student anymore. The news is already spreading across campus, and soon the national media will know. I'm sure security will be tighter. Many will see me not as a person, but as a symbol, Trump's son, with all the prejudices that come with it. That doesn't sound very optimistic, Mallow noted. But there is another side, Barron continued. Perhaps some of those present will see me as more than just a name, but a person. Perhaps this will be a small step toward bridging the gap that divides our country. Elizabeth listened to him with growing interest. You know, you're not at all what I expected, she said. What kind of me did you expect? Asked the Baron with a slight smile. I don't know. Arrogant? Privileged? Out of touch with reality? I am privileged, the Baron admitted calmly. It would be foolish to deny it, but that doesn't mean I can't strive to understand other people's experiences. At that moment, a tall black student the Baron didn't know pushed his way through the small crowd that surrounded them. Barron Trump? He asked bluntly. Is that really you? Yes, the Baron answered simply. Then explain it. The student practically shoved the phone in his face. The screen showed a Twitter feed with the hashtag Trump immigration policy and a video of crying children at the border. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The tension became palpable, almost tangible, once again. I understand your outrage, Barron said calmly, looking the student straight in the eye. And I'm not going to defend every decision the administration makes. I've said before that my mother has spoken out publicly against family separation. I'm speaking as a human being, not as a White House official. It's easy to say when you're not the one affected, the student responded furiously. My cousin was almost deported, even though she's here legally, because of bureaucratic red tape and tightened checks. The room fell silent again. Some students looked confused, others openly hostile. You're right, the Baron suddenly agreed. I can't really understand what that's like, and I'm truly sorry for what your family has gone through. The student clearly did not expect such an answer. He froze, not knowing what to say next. I can't change policy by talking, the Baron continued, but I can listen, understand, and perhaps be a bridge between worlds that barely speak to each other now. Empty words, the student shook his head, but there was no longer the same anger in his voice. Perhaps, the Baron agreed, but words are the beginning of dialogue, and dialogue is the beginning of understanding. Elizabeth watched this exchange with growing interest. You know what? She suddenly turned to the black student. Jamal, right? I'm planning on interviewing Barron for the Chronicle. Why don't you join in? Ask your questions directly. Jamal looked at her in surprise. Are you serious? You want to give a platform? I want a real conversation, Elizabeth interrupted. Not an echo chamber, not another angry tweet. A conversation where all sides are heard. Aren't you afraid that you'll be accused of normalizing? Jamal began. I get accused of something every day, Elizabeth shrugged. I'm the editor of the student newspaper. My job is to show different sides of a story, not to promote one point of view. Professor Mallow, who had been watching the proceedings, came closer. Ms. Chen, that's an interesting suggestion. Perhaps we could expand the format, have an open discussion where students could ask Mr. Trump their questions in a controlled, respectful environment. Like a student forum, Elizabeth clarified. Exactly, Mallow nodded. If Mr. Trump agrees, of course. All eyes turned to the Baron. I agree, he said decisively. On one condition, it must be a real dialogue, not an interrogation or an indictment. Fair enough, Mallow agreed. Miss Chen, perhaps you could take charge of the organization? With your experience with the student newspaper? Of course, Elizabeth nodded. I can bring together representatives of different student groups, create a truly inclusive space. When would you like to hold this forum? Barron asked, checking his phone, which was constantly vibrating with notifications. The sooner the better, Elizabeth replied. Before the news gets out in all the media? Maybe tonight? That's ambitious, Mallow noted. But it's possible. I could book the Great Hall if the deanery agrees. I need to clear this with security, Barron noted, looking at his phone. A public event involving me will now require additional security measures. We could make it a private event, Mallow suggested. Students and faculty only, with pre-registration. I understand the risks, Barron nodded, but I also understand the importance of the moment. We cannot miss this opportunity for dialogue. Elizabeth looked at him with growing respect. Do you really believe this can make a difference? She asked quietly. I don't know, the Baron answered honestly. But I know that silence certainly won't change anything. At that moment, the door to the auditorium swung open again. A breathless student with a camera stood on the threshold. Is it true, he blurted out? The president's son really goes to school here? The Baron sighed. Jamal and Elizabeth exchanged glances. Professor Mallow shook her head. Jason, she said sternly to the student with the camera, take that down immediately. You're violating privacy rules. But this is public information, Jason countered. People have a right to know. People have a right to human dignity, Elizabeth said suddenly sharply, stepping between the Baron and the camera. Even if you don't share their political views. Jason lowered the camera, looking confused. Thank you, Baron Elizabeth said quietly. Their eyes met the daughter of ardent Democrats and the son of a Republican president. Two people who by all rights should have been opponents, but at that moment stood on the same side, the side of humanity and mutual respect. Baron's phone rang again. This time he looked at the screen and his face became serious. I need to answer, he said. It's from the White House. The Baron took a few steps back and took the call, speaking quietly but confidently. The students watched with undisguised curiosity. It's not every day you see your classmate talking to the White House. A minute later, he returned. I have to go, he said regretfully. Security matters. Elizabeth, Professor Mallow, I'll contact you as soon as I've sorted everything out. Okay, Elizabeth nodded. I'll start preparing the form. The Baron headed for the door. The students parted for him, some whispering, others openly filming on their phones. His anonymity was irretrievably lost. But before he left, he turned around one last time. Thank you for this conversation, he said, looking around the room, for the opportunity to be heard not as Trump's son, but as a human being. And with that, he left. The room was silent, broken only by whispers and the sound of social media notifications. Elizabeth met Professor Mallow's gaze. They were normally allies in political discussions. But something was different now. Something important had happened in this room, a shift that was hard to describe in words, but impossible not to feel. What do you think, Professor? Elizabeth broke the silence. About this. About today. Mallow looked thoughtfully at the door the Baron had just exited through. I think we've all learned a valuable lesson. A lesson about how easily we turn people into symbols, and symbols into caricatures, and how difficult it is to see the real people behind those caricatures. The students listened silently, many with their eyes downcast. A moment of silence, not empty, but filled with awareness, again engulfed the room. Even if nothing changes in big politics, Elizabeth continued, as if thinking out loud, something has already changed here, in this audience. We have seen a person where before we saw only a symbol. Jamal, standing next to him, nodded slowly. I'm still angry about the immigration policy, he said. But you're right. It's weird, but he seemed real. Real, Elizabeth echoed. In a world of fake news, political masks, and ideological echo chambers, that may be the rarest and most valuable quality. The buzz in the hallway outside the door was already growing as the news spread like wildfire across campus. The quiet moment of reflection in this room was likely the last before the story spilled out into the public domain, with all the distortions and exaggerations that would come with it. Professor Mallow took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength before the approaching storm. Miss Chen, let's discuss the details of the forum. I think we need to act quickly. Elizabeth nodded, taking out her notebook. She felt a strange excitement, not just the journalistic thrill of a hot story, but something deeper, a sense that she was on the cusp of something important, something that might help heal even the smallest rift in a divided society. And somewhere deep inside, she hoped that this feeling was not just a naive illusion.